we kick off with our first invited speakers of the day, Helen and I thought we'd talk about what we think the key focus of today is and some of the key aspects of what distracted driving is. I think we've all probably got an understanding of what we think distracted driving is, but there's many different forms, as represented by this wonderful slide here. So there are a range of distractions available to drivers, and we're going to discuss these in quite a bit of detail today. But these distractions can be manual, they can be visual, and they can be cognitive, or they can be all three, but all share the fact that they negatively impact on road safety in terms of impaired driver performance. So the presentations that we'll enjoy today will look at several different aspects of distraction. So our own research, for example, focuses very much on mobile phone use by drivers, which is probably the predominant key distractor that you think of when you think of distracted driving. But of course, there's a lot more. We've got infotainment, and we're going to have a talk today on that as well. And then those other kind of visual things, and the grey area of, well, what about your smartwatch? How does the law work in relation to that? So we're going to look at some scientific research on the roots of distraction, that cognitive distraction, and we're also going to look at aspects of the law, how they can be applied, and how that law can or can't effectively be enforced. So I think it's fair to say that in terms of public perceptions, driver distraction, often you think of handheld mobile phone use, the illegal type of behaviour, and other manual interactions with devices behind the wheel. But certainly in research terms, I think as a research community, we're far more interested in cognitive distraction. It's not to say that we don't think physically manipulating a device or looking away from the road isn't a problem. Of course that's a problem. But cognitive distraction is the thread that runs through all of these types of behaviours. And so that's what we're interested in investigating in particular. So it's that distinction between manual and visual distraction and cognitive distraction, and what that means in terms of the laws that are available to us, whether or not those laws are effective, whether or not they need to be developed, and there's some of the discussions that we'll have today.
Okay. So I think one of our really strong motivations, and hence the title of today, was to refocus on distracted driving and make sure we're not just thinking about the enforcement of the 2003 mobile phone law as tweaked in 2022. And our thinking, I think, was really around the idea that a lot of the reporting around that law and a lot of perhaps the perception around that law was that once we'd tweaked it, once we'd closed the loophole, once we'd put Barretto to bed, as it were, it was kind of job done. And I think we were really keen to make it, to talk to a room of people about how that isn't really the case. There are lots and lots of things that remain that law simply does not cover. But if we think about that law for a bit, we can see that it itself is also struggling to keep up with the nature of distraction and the nature of opportunities that are available to us in our vehicles. So if we think about how the law is phrased, it refers to handheld use, as Gemma's already suggested. Does that relate, is a smartwatch that gives you your text messages, is that handheld? When we think about use, what is use? There are lots and lots of ways that use is being redefined and reinvented that probably aren't covered by the law and never will be, because the process of legislation building is a very necessarily slow and laborious process. But technology advances much quicker. It's on the market before the law has any chance of catching up with it. Similarly, if we think about the concept of the mobile phone, that's changing. So a law related to handheld mobile phone use while driving already looks a little bit dated. The concept of driving, even, is changing before our eyes. The law isn't necessarily going to be able to keep up with things like assisted, self-driving, autonomous. Whether or not drivers even understand what that means, the law also has to get a grip on it. And indeed, we might even, in the next few years, have to think about what actually counts as a vehicle. So in all those senses, the law is not going to be enough. It's always going to be playing catch-up, and that's part of our problem.
Okay. So in terms of the scale of distraction, we'll just whiz through this. So the coloured circles that you can see on the screen represent police-attended incidents, and this is the year ending November 2021, I think, these data. So you can see that the different colours represent the different categories where an attending officer has recorded a contributory factor to an incident. So if you look down towards the bottom left, you'll see a red circle that is impairment and distraction. And then the other red circles are subcategories of that. So in there you've got mobile phone use, you've got engagement with other things, you've got screaming children in the back, although I'm sure they phrase it slightly differently. So if we look at that in terms of the whole picture, we might think, well, actually, impairment and distraction isn't a massive problem compared to other aspects of causal factors for incidents, because the largest blob that we've got there, the orange one, is driver or rider error, which is a whole other day conference we could do on the issue of attributing things to driver error, because what do you do then? Do we just assume that it's okay that an error is made? Do we investigate the underlying cause of that? Or do we just say, we're humans, we make mistakes, oh well? From my own research, I would argue that a lot of legal and illegal distractions, so handheld and hands-free mobile phone use, for example, are likely to contribute to this orange blob of driver and rider error, the largest subcategory of which is failure to look and failure to judge the speed of another road user. So driver distraction is a growing problem. I think all of us will have seen handheld phone use on a daily basis as well. We know, and I know I'm talking to a room who's very knowledgeable on this, but 5 people a day die on UK roads, 50 to 60 are seriously injured, and these figures are not declining. They've plateaued for several years. We know that from recent research by the RAC, for example, that around a quarter of drivers admit to regular, illegal handheld mobile phone use, while still claiming to support the law. And we'll come to aspects of how that might happen. Of course, contributory factors are problematic because they only report those incidents that were attended by a police officer where contributory factors were recorded. So this is kind of minimising the true scale of the number of incidents that happen on the road. And legal forms of distraction, as I've alluded to, hands-free mobile phone use, aren't necessarily appropriately reflected in these kind of data. So, as a starting point, anyone who's heard me speak at all will be very familiar with this slide. I thought it would be useful for us all to be on a starting point of the research in relation to mobile phone use, because we will consistently come back to this throughout the day. So drivers using a mobile phone are 4 times more likely to be involved in a collision than an undistracted driver. And this effect persists for around 5 minutes after your engagement with the phone has ended. This is the cognitive distraction that we're talking about. It's not just about hands on the wheel and eyes on the road. Distracted drivers are far less likely to notice hazards. Those hazards they do notice, they take significantly longer to react to. And you'll hear from some of our speakers today looking at what that means in terms of stopping distances, what that means in real terms. They show poor lane discipline. They might weave a little bit. They make variable speed choices dependent on the demands of their phone conversation. And they use compensatory strategies, which is a polite way of saying they don't check their mirrors and they don't use their indicators. So their situational awareness is massively depleted. And none of these factors are improved by using a hands-free kit. All equal in terms of distraction. Now, other forms of handheld mobile phone use, texting, you're around 23 times more likely to be involved in a collision. So that's the dark triad of visual, manual, and cognitive distraction. And I'm sure we'll have questions later today about, mobile phone use while stopped in traffic, texting. What's the cognitive cost? So we will return to that.
So what tools are available to us then for dealing with distracted driving? We've broken those up into the traditional kind of 3E approaches. We're not just thinking about mobile phones there again, but they're going to be a theme throughout the day, obviously. So through enforcement, you've got all the work that the police, the human officers do, but also the growth in technology that offers to be there, either to detect or to potentially deter people from offending. But you've also got that education, that element of trying to win the hearts and minds of people so that actually they don't offend and they don't allow themselves to become distracted, important distinction, even when there's nobody looking. So that internal moderation, that internal commitment to the law, that normative commitment stops them from being distracted because they just think it's the right thing to do. And that's what a lot of our education is trying to achieve, or at least should be trying to achieve. And then you've got the engineering ones, the ones that go, well, we'll literally take it out of your hands. We'll install things, we'll put things in that actually stop the technology from working. We'll separate that sense of you from the usefulness of the device. Kind of like if you can't be trusted with all the others, we'll just introduce the blockers there. So what I think the important thing to note there, and we'll have presentations that relate to a lot of those different aspects throughout the day, but the important thing to note there, I think, is if we could enforce things like the mobile phone law and we get 100% compliance with that law, let's just imagine a world where that's possible, we're still not going to really impact that much on that big orange blob that Gemma shared with you earlier, because a lot of the distraction will not be cured by the enforcement of that law. So what are the barriers? What's stopping us from succeeding that we can be thinking about today? So as we've already said, the mobile phone law is focused on just one form of distraction. It's actually, if you had a Venn diagram of distraction, the actual mobile phone law 2003/22 would be quite a small little bit of overlap in that diagram. Yes, of course, we've got other laws. We've got failing to maintain proper control. We've got careless driving. But the issue, I think, with those, particularly for me as a criminologist, is that they're not preventative. They rely on the behaviour becoming impaired, on driving showing a negative impact before they can be used. They're not going to deter people. We'll come to reasons for that in a moment. They're not preventative. And we've also got the fact that actually, the police cannot, probably should not, be everywhere, and nor can technology. So if people are aware of where policing or where the technology is, that creates dark spots where people think, actually, it's safe to offend here because I'm not going to get caught. And that's before we think about things like detectability and provability. Not sure if either of them are words, but they're working for us today. So detectability, think about hands-free. Think about how you would identify somebody who was using their phone hands-free before it started to visibly affect their driving. It looks like they're singing along to their music. It looks like they're having a bit of a word with themselves. Very hard to detect and very hard to prove. Yes, we can probably look at devices, we can look at the call use history, we can look at telematics to identify if somebody was distracted. But again, that's after the fact. That's actually most likely to happen when someone's technology is requisitioned after they've caused a serious or potentially fatal collision. It's not going to happen in your run-of-the-mill, just got away with it, near misses. So it's not going to put anybody off. And one of the things that we keep coming back to in this research, and I think explains so much of the problems that we all face, is driver self-enhancement bias. 80% of drivers, some research says nearly 90, think they're better than average. Now, as I say, I'm not a friend of the numbers, but I can see that there's a bit of a problem going on there. If people think they're better than average, they will not think that any of these things apply to them. They will, as Gemma said, support the law, but probably still break it as well, because they think all those other inferior drivers absolutely should be regulated. But their own daily experience, their own experiments in risk, if you like, are that every day they go out and do this, every day they go out and speed, every day they go out and they take hands-free or handheld calls. Nothing happened. And that reinforces that self-enhancement bias until the day when it doesn't. And of course, those people are not around to be evangelists to the fact that they were wrong. Or it's too late because they've killed or injured somebody else. So that sense that it doesn't apply to me underpins a lot of the challenges I think we face with enforcement and with education. And then we come to the final point, which I think you kind of want to give up whenever you end up with the solution is common sense, which is what we're really saying there. But what can we do? What can we do to inform and empower people to make better decisions when they are, quite reasonably, often looking to the law to guide what's safe and dangerous behaviour? But we have a context where, unfortunately, the law is giving the wrong signals. I think we've just got the... onto them. Yeah.
Right, we've set the scene. We'll be back later to rant a little bit more about the law and the issues with the law. But let's get started.